Hello, this is Justin Kennedy doing the final project presentation for Refuge and Refugees class. Hello, Dr. Grace. I will go ahead and preface by saying, to be honest, I wasn't exactly clear what was required in this presentation, so I'm just going to discuss the final project I opted to do. I chose to interview my father, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, who was a refugee from Ghana from the early 1980s. I felt that his experience would be like kind of a good, like good case study for the experience that refugees can undergo when going through North America. He was a refugee a while ago, back in the 1980s, so some of the things he went through were a little different back then. Yeah, I think a lot of the experiences he went through, though, were still pretty like applicable to modern day refugees, and I think stands as a pretty good symbol of the refugee mission. What I ought to do is kind of transcribe this conversation with him. The first time I was doing anything like that, so honestly, in hindsight, I kind of wish I just recorded it. But I did try. I did type out pretty much the whole conversation, and that is already submitted on Blackboard. So there's a few things I want to highlight with my father's story. So long story short, he was a student leader in the 1980s. He protested the takeover of a military government. There was a military coup in the Ghana in the early 1980s led by a guy called Rawlins. My dad protested. He was eventually had to flee the country for safety to Ivory Coast. He eventually was able to return because of like student protest calling for his return. He was lucky because he was a student leader who was a high profile figure, which is partially what led to him being targeted, but at the same time was why he could come back because there were people that would essentially stand up for him, right? Which I think was a big contrast with a lot of other refugees, and part in that way he was somewhat lucky that he was so well known. A big part of the reason why he was even able to escape in the first place was because he had people to like kind of like help smuggle him out, like people who didn't really know who he was but kind of knew his cause and kind of believed in him, you know what I mean? So I think kind of like that individual human kindness is a big part of the reason why he's able to escape and survive to today. Like the UN helped him once he was in Ivory Coast, but I think it's important to note that like there's a lot of people on the ground that helped him escape even before that point. Also, his time in Ivory Coast is well. I guess I'll get into that later. A comparison, but after he returned, he continued the same thing, which I think I have to really respect him for that. Like he really stuck to his guns and continued to discuss it. And eventually, after giving a speech once again denouncing the military government, he was run out in his final year of medical school, and once again had to return to the Ivory Coast, fearing his safety. Honestly, it was actually where he learned. Funnily enough, in the first place, the way he left was actually got like his like UN agent in trouble because he actually didn't leave safely, and um, he was actually in a lot of danger. And he went back, and he went back partially because he missed the place. Like that was his hometown. He missed his family, his friends, and all that kind of thing. And so, the fact that he went back in the danger to look at that really, I think, is a good indication of like that kind of mental toll from being drifted apart from all the family and the people. And so eventually he ends up in Toronto. He actually finds the place very welcoming. Of course, it's a pretty big climate shift, given how cold it is and versus Ghana, which is a tropical country. But he actually finds a pretty nice community there. And also, I think it's interesting how important the fact that everyone speaks English there is. And of course, Ghana, a former British colony, has a very common English-speaking population, contrasted with the Ivory Coast, which is a French colony, and thus most people speak French. And so he actually found it like much easier to adapt in Toronto. And he actually found a welcome community there where he could kind of grow and blossom. And he still lives in North America today, so I guess I'm happy that he found the place so welcoming. But the reason why I mainly chose to share his story is because I think it's an important. It's like it kind of makes everything we learn in the class real. Like this is a real person that I know, but obviously very important to me. But a person that can like that just kind of like makes it. He's like a realistic person essentially. Like he's here, he's in front of us, he lives in this community. It's not the refugee in the abstract. There's a real person that went through the process and whose life was affected in the process in the long term. I think that's another important thing to note about refugees. Like even for refugees to get a lot of media attention when whatever crisis that pushes them out occurs, they are forgotten in the public eye very rather quickly. You know what I mean? And like in a few years' time after the Ukrainian invasion, will Ukrainian refugees still be getting that same attention and impact? And my father's life was impacted for decades after that refugee. Like situation ended. And so I think it's important to note that like these things have very long-reaching consequences for people, right? And that's even for like topics that are like make big news, because I don't think the coup in Ghana back in the 1980s was relevant to Western audiences at the time. And so I think at the core of it, it's just important to remember that these are real suffering people that are just, they're not just helpless victims, but at the same time, these are people that we have the resources to help.